This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. More than 2 decades ago, the Violence Against Women Act, or VAWA, was signed into law. The federal law helped reduce domestic violence in the U.S. by more than 60%. But Congress has yet to reauthorize the landmark domestic violence law. It lapsed last year. How does this impact programs to prevent domestic violence and help survivors nationwide, including here in Connecticut? Today, Where We Live, we find out, including how the federal law addresses Native American communities and what gaps remain. Lynn Malurba will join us. She's chief of the Mohegan tribe in Uncasville, Connecticut. First, the most dangerous time for a woman in a domestic violence relationship is when she tries to leave her abuser. Federal law bans people under permanent restraining orders from buying or possessing a firearm, but that's not the case for people under temporary restraining orders. Lindsay, a reporter for Connecticut Public Radio, reported on this for the Guns in America Public Radio Reporting Collaborative. And Ryan joins me now in studio. Ryan, welcome back to the show.
Thank you for having me.
Before we hear about this very powerful story that you reported on, I wanted to just to give this warning to our listeners. We're going to be talking about what happened to one Connecticut woman, and our conversation will include graphic descriptions of domestic violence. So, Ryan, tell us about Lori Jackson. Who was she?
Yes, Lori Jackson was born and raised in Oxford, the town of Oxford, Connecticut. Her parents built this beautiful log home from scratch, and I went out there and saw the home myself. And she lived, I guess, a fairly normal life. There's her mother shared pictures of her at a high school dance that she was going to when she had just graduated, a picture in her sweatshirt. And so at one point in time, Lori met her then husband, and his name was Scott. And her mother had questions about that relationship. She was concerned about how he was treating her and noticed that he seemed to be rather controlling, nitpicky things like he might always want to sit next to her at a family gathering or would pinch her arm and say, oh, no, it's just little love bites. And so there are things that definitely began to raise concern for Mary Jackson. But eventually her daughter made the decision that she wanted to get married. And not too long after, she was pregnant with twins. And then, their relationship sort of, it became complicated. It became violent at times. And it ultimately ended with Lori's death, which was a really challenging and heartbreaking thing to have to witness and for that family, the Jackson family, to go through.
So Lori Jackson was killed by her husband, Scott, in 2014. At the time, so when things started to go really badly in the relationship, what did Lori and her mother, Mary Jackson, do?
So Lori and Scott had a fight, and Lori fled down the streets. She lived a couple houses over from her parents in Oxford, and she left. And then the next day, Scott left. And so they were unable to find him for about 5 weeks. But what her and her mother did was go to the courthouse to file a temporary restraining order. Now, in 2014 in Connecticut, even if there was a temporary restraining order against you, you were still able to purchase or possess a gun. And that could also happen outside of state lines. And so what happened was that Scott purchased a firearm, according to police report, in Virginia, a handgun, because when he left, he actually took his shotgun with him, which Lori and her mother were aware of, and then returned, unfortunately, that day in 2015 to fatally shoot Lori and then wound Mary. Was shot several times.
Oh, I'm sorry. She was murdered in 2015?
2014. I'm sorry about that.
Okay.
And so then that led lawmakers and a lot of folks in Connecticut to ask to realize and see that there is a gap. And so in 2016 here in Connecticut, they made it illegal for someone who does have a TRO against them to purchase or possess a firearm.
So you spoke to Lori Jackson's mother, Mary Jackson. When Lori Jackson tried to get a temporary restraining order, she was able to, the court agreed.
Yes.
But for Mary Jackson, that didn't happen.
Yes.
And was that concerning to Mary?
It was. I think that she had a legitimate reason to feel she felt that she was in danger. There were times she shared with me that Scott would come home very angry and, point its finger in her face or get really close and yell at her and things like that, or follow her out to the car, because Mary herself had retired to take care of the twin children. And so she was experiencing that treatment, and she wasn't happy about it. But for whatever reason, the courts did not grant herself that protection, but Lori was granted that TRO. And in that 5 weeks that Scott was gone, Lori's restraining order actually expired, and so she had applied for another one and actually had a date for a permanent restraining order, a hearing date. But unfortunately, Scott came back and took her life before that was possible.
You spoke with Mary Jackson, as I mentioned, and she told you what happened that day. We're going to play a part of that interview for our listeners.
We were fighting at the door, and at that time, he had Lori by the hair, and he was trying to pull her out, and Lori and I had our arms clasped, and, we were both pulling against him and screaming, and he was losing the battle, and he just let go with one hand and went in his pocket and pulled out a gun.
And so he shot both Lori Jackson and her mother.
Yes. If she said that, they were there fighting when they heard him initially at the door. He was banging on the door. Mary Jackson was wearing a panic button around her neck because they just said that during those 5 weeks, they were living in constant fear. She had a fear. She said that we knew that he was coming in a rage. So they knew that oftentimes, which is sort of kind of challenging to wrap your head around, but the reality is that when women take these steps to leave a relationship, that escalates and amplifies the potential for violence. And so they have the protection through a restraining order in some form or fashion, but then that's when the abusive partner seems that they are losing that control, or there only may be a certain amount of time until they can, they're losing their control in those situations. And so they were very fearful of what Scott could do, that he did have access to a firearm and then was able to get another one through a legal sale. And
in another state.
In another state, right. And so that was just something that when, I spoke with a police officer who Lori had gone to the Oxford Police Department to file a domestic violence report against her husband, and this particular officer was a state trooper at the time, and so he would call and check on her. And one of the things that he said was, I wish we had the manpower to really be outside of the home to provide that physical barrier of protection that could have prevented Scott from coming back into the home. But unfortunately, they didn't have the manpower to do so. And it created a really precarious situation. They didn't know where he was, what state he was in. At one point in time, he had, spoken with police and mentioned that he was in Florida. Hindsight, the police officer said he was probably making his way back from Virginia up to Connecticut for that terrible morning when he came, stormed in the house, and eventually, killed his wife and seriously wounded Mary. Mary had a series of surgeries. She was shot in the jaw, and one of the bullets exited through her eye. And so she didn't even get to attend Lori's funeral because she was still in the hospital recovering from those injuries.
It's a hard story to hear. Ryan Lindsay with me, reporter for Connecticut Public Radio and the Guns in America Public Radio Reporting Collaborative. Ryan, you mentioned in 2014 in Connecticut at the time with these restraining orders, there was the gap for abusers to potentially buy or possess firearms. So with Mary losing her daughter, she actually heard from U.S. Senator Richard Blumenthal, and the law was changed. Tell us how that happened.
So Senator Blumenthal met Mary within months of the shooting, and he recalls that she was still in bandages when he met her, and they had a few conversations. The Jacksons, Mary and Doug, traveled to Washington, D.C. to advocate for the passage of what Blumenthal introduced as the Lori Jackson Domestic Violence Survivor Protection Act to Congress in 2013-14 session of Congress, and went on to introduce it a few more times. Now the language for the Lori Jackson Domestic Violence Survivor Protection Act has been rolled into VAWA, and so that's specifically looking at this. Some folks have described it as a loophole, basically, that allows abusers to still legally purchase and possess firearms even when they have a temporary restraining order against them. So one of the things that's happening with this newest version of VAWA is that people are seeking those, or lawmakers and domestic violence advocates are supporting or seeking to have that protection made law federally. And so that basically alleviates the potential of someone being able to go across a state border just to one, two, three, several states away and purchase something that they could ultimately do harm with.
Mm. In Connecticut, the law was changed regarding temporary restraining orders, but you mentioned the federal law, there is still that gap.
Yes. So in 2016, Representative Robin Porter herself is a survivor of domestic violence, and so she put a lot of her weight behind that legislation that went on to pass here in 2016, just 2 years after Lori was fatally shot by her husband. And that has seemingly made a difference here in Connecticut when it comes to domestic violence fatalities. Mm-hmm. Guns still remain the number one weapon when for these intimate partner homicides. And something that April Zioli, she's a researcher at University of Michigan, looked at is that when states apply this protection to temporary restraining orders, there is an overall 16% decrease in intimate partner homicides with a firearm, and a 13% decrease with intimate partner homicides as a whole. So basically what that means, or the difference, is that it wasn't just changing. There weren't just fewer homicides with a firearm. There were fewer homicides overall. So abusers weren't resorting to, a knife or some other sort of weapon to commit these crimes. It did have, providing those protections with the temporary restraining order was decreasing the number of women that were dying at the hands of their partner overall.
We did reach out to the Connecticut Coalition Against Domestic Violence. Its CEO, Karen Jarmock, also reiterated what you had mentioned, Ryan, Lindsay, that according to the Connecticut Domestic Violence Fatality Review Task Force, firearms continue to be the main use of force in domestic violence homicides over the past decade in our state. Again, Ryan Lindsay is with me, reporter for Connecticut Public Radio and the Guns in America Public Radio Reporting Collaborative. This is Where We Live. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. Coming up, we're going to talk more about the Violence Against Women Act, known as VAWA, passed into law about more than 25 years ago. This federal law needs to be reauthorized. As Ryan reported, a version of VAWA would address this gap that allows people under temporary restraining orders to still possess or buy a firearm. We're going to talk more about that after the break. You can join us too. Find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. We're talking about gaps that exist to help domestic violence victims. Now, protections have been in place under the federal Violence Against Women Act, but this law passed more than 25 years ago needs to be reauthorized. Now, before we talk about what the debate has been in Congress, we wanted to learn more about how the federal law came to be and what it has accomplished over the last 2 decades. Before I bring in my next guest, I did want to mention, if you or someone you know is in a domestic violence situation in Connecticut, the statewide hotline for help is 888-774-2900. If you're a Spanish speaker, it's 844-831-9200. Now, joining our conversation now by phone, Julie Goldscheid is professor at the City University of New York, or CUNY Law School. Julie, welcome to Where We Live.
Thank you.
Also with me in studio is Ryan Lindsay, a reporter for Connecticut Public Radio. Julie, I read the statistic that after VAWA was passed in the U.S., domestic violence cases actually dropped more than 60%. So what was it looking like, again, before advocates started to push Congress to make some changes?
Yeah, so of course, the Violence Against Women Act was a very historic change in our federal laws, because it was the first time that there was federal, nationwide recognition of domestic violence, intimate partner violence, as well as sexual assault. So I think it's important to remember that intimate partner violence and sexual assault exist on a continuum, and the programming, although the initial version of VAWA focused perhaps primarily on domestic violence, it also covered sexual assault, sexual violence as well, which of course has come into the public attention in recent years with the Me Too movement. So, but yeah, before VAWA was passed in 1994, states had been active. There had been some federal legislation providing funding, for example, for domestic violence emergency shelters. But it was the first time the federal government, Congress, bipartisan Congress, passed a law comprehensively addressing the problem. And it did so after 4 years of history and careful deliberation and testimony from people from all parts of the community about the problem, the devastation it causes, as we heard from this important reporting that you've just recounted, and what the law can do to help.
Some of our listeners may know this, but Vice President Joe Biden played a significant role in the passage of VAWA. How did he become an ally?
He was really moved by the issue, and he spearheaded working with Congress and working with advocates to develop a law that addressed the problem from multiple perspectives. So the 1994 bill, as it was passed, directed a lot of funding to the issue. I believe it was $1.6 billion to address the problem over the course of 6 years, and that funding primarily was address the criminal legal system, which in more recent years has come to be critiqued for its limitations and for the problems that it has and the way it disproportionately harms certain communities. But even the 1994 bill also funded services for survivors, for example, counseling, emergency shelter, advocacy. The initial bill included really important provisions that were drafted in consultation with advocates to help undocumented immigrant survivors, to make sure that they could help stabilize their status without having to rely on their abuser. And the 1994 bill also included a civil rights remedy that would make it a part of our complement of federal civil rights laws to enable somebody who had been subjected to gender-based violence, meaning intimate partner violence or sexual violence, to sue the person who committed that act in federal court as a violation of their civil rights. And that part of the law attracted a lot of attention during the initial passage, and it ultimately was declared unconstitutional by the Supreme Court in 2000.
Before we get more into some of what's happened since VAWA has been renewed several times since 1994, I did want to go back to when we're talking about intimate partner violence. There was this other stat that we saw that 6 out of 10 women who were murdered in 1991 were killed by someone they knew. So how did Americans respond to this idea that violence, assault, could be perpetrated by someone you know and not just a stranger?
Yeah. Well, there are long-standing stereotypes. It's sort of there's a inconsistency. Intimate partner violence is so prevalent, and yet we know so little about it and are reluctant to talk about it. So we have stereotypes where people think that how could that happen? And, it must just be a dispute or a disagreement gone awry. And historically, when police would be called to the scene of what has been called a domestic dispute, they would want to just separate the partners. They would, tell the aggressor, usually the man, to take a walk around the block. And we didn't really recognize how serious the problem is. And we didn't really recognize that in many, many cases, what might start as the coercive, the controlling kind of behavior that you talked about in your reporting escalates into the kind of lethal violence that, is so unfortunate and so harmful.
I mentioned that VAWA now needs to be reauthorized. Congress took this issue up, I believe, a year ago. Ryan Lindsay, who's with me from Connecticut Public Radio, this debate over renewing VAWA, not clearing both the House and the Senate. Some of the holdup is because of people wondering how this would infringe on Second Amendment rights. Can you explain that for us?
Right. So the VAWA for funding, or the funding for VAWA, there we go, is for the most part, still intact. It's from the Office of Violence Against Women, which is a federal office underneath the DOJ, the Department of Justice. And so these domestic violence organizations are still able to apply for funding, and that was the case. There was a lapse for VAWA. It wasn't reauthorized, or it was unauthorized, I should say, between 2010 and 2013. So this gap has happened before, but the difference with this version of VAWA is that there's roughly 4 to 5 provisions that really look to address some loopholes or some current concerns in a way sort of legislate behavior or what can and can't happen. One of those is the temporary restrictive order that we talked about, providing broader coverage. Another one is what folks refer to frequently as a boyfriend loophole. And so what that means is that the way it's currently written, protections for partners can only be provided with it's very, very specific criteria. So someone you had to have been married to, someone who lived with you. So these stipulations, as many advocates and organizations are pointing out, are not enough, because what about the boyfriend who you're no longer with, who still knows where you live, who still can come back to your home, who can still stalk you? And that's also part of it, is that they're looking to pass include this enhancement in VAWA that basically says anyone who's convicted of stalking loses their ability to purchase or possess a firearm. And so those have raised some concerns with folks who are saying this is preventing us or people really from having due process, yes, from being able to, go before a court and have that play out, versus just saying, okay, you've committed this misdemeanor, and now you're not allowed to purchase or possess a firearm. So there definitely have been concerns about that when it comes to this current version of VAWA.
Julie Goldscheid, have you heard from Ryan Lindsay about these new provisions? What is your response to this, how this debate has really tied up reauthorizing VAWA for the future?
Yeah, it's so interesting. So the law initially passed in 1994. It was drafted in a way that the funding provisions had to be reauthorized in 2000, and it was again reauthorized in 2000, really without much controversy. And, with each reauthorization, the drafters have taken into account input from the field and have improved it to try to tailor services to be more responsive to what survivors really need and to improve our responses with the goal of really preventing intimate partner and sexual violence. So in 2000, it was reauthorized to address dating violence and to fund civil legal services and to improve provisions for battered immigrants. In 2005, it was also reauthorized, again, with very little controversy, increasing attention and services and resources for underserved communities and to improve housing provisions, to fund rape crisis centers. But in 2011, as Ryan described, that's when it was held up, and it was the focus of a lot of controversy at that time over the provisions helping undocumented immigrants who were survivors, helping Native Americans, and an anti-discrimination provision that would prohibit discrimination in services against LGBT survivors. So ultimately it was passed in 2013, but not without a fight. So again, in a way, no surprise if you take into account how partisan Congress has become. In a way, no surprise that there again is controversy, and it's over those same issues. It's about the anti-discrimination provision that would ensure equal access for everyone, including LGBT survivors, as well as the services for Native survivors. And it also includes now this controversy over the so-called boyfriend loophole and the other provisions, seeking to close the loopholes in and address what we know about the relationship between gun violence, gun possession, and intimate partner violence.
With me by phone again is Julie Goldscheid, a professor at City University of New York Law School, or CUNY Law School. And with me in studio, Ryan Lindsay, reporter for Connecticut Public Radio and the Guns in America Public Radio Reporting Collaborative. Julie, you mentioned in the past bipartisan support and that fact that it is concerning that this is becoming a partisan issue. What are your concerns moving forward if this reauthorization continues to be delayed?
Yeah. So as Ryan said, what has happened in the past, Congress has has continued funding for the programs that are funded through VAWA through annual appropriations bills, but that's not as secure, it's not as certain as having a law on the books, ideally, that would create some sort of permanent funding. Some advocates are calling for permanent funding for at least some of the programs. As drafted, the law has had, about 5-year windows, and that just provides a lot more security for people who are running programs, usually on a shoestring, even when you have federal funding. So it's both the wear and tear of having to constantly apply for funding, but also the uncertainty. How can you train and hire staff if you're not certain how long your funding is going to continue?
I mentioned we reached out to the Connecticut Coalition Against Domestic Violence, Karen Jarmock. She also added, while the financial resources around domestic violence advocacy remain intact, the longevity and sustainability of such critical supports is at a continued risk until this measure is formally approved. So she is echoing what you're saying, Julie.
Yeah. And I think, it's great to see the statistics showing decreases in domestic violence, but some programs also are reporting an increase in demand, and it's for intimate partner violence, but also for sexual violence. I think, especially in the wake of the Me Too movement, many people are feeling more empowered to speak out and to realize that there may be help out there and are reaching out to service providers for help, and that assistance is critically important in helping people move on and reckon with what has happened. And some of the important provisions that are included in the version of the VAWA reauthorization that was passed by the Senate would go a long way to addressing prevention and some of the other underlying problems that continue to wreak havoc in survivors' lives. So some of those important provisions address things like economic security, health care, housing, increase options for incarcerated survivors, and increase some alternatives to incarceration, since we've learned that really is not the best response in many cases to intimate partner and sexual violence.
I wanted to go back to Ryan Lindsay, reporter for Connecticut Public Radio. Ryan, you did mention earlier about Senator Richard Blumenthal proposing federal legislation to address, again, this gap with temporary restraining orders. Any other thoughts from your reporting as we look to see if VAWA is reauthorized?
Something that Julie said is very true in terms of the number of women being harmed by people they already know. And that's a statistic that's mirrored when it comes to sexual assault and violence, is that generally, if I'm not mistaken, it's well over 60% of sexual assault and violence that happens by people that know each other. And so it's sort of not the I was, violated by a person on the street, but it could be that boyfriend, that partner. There was also, I guess, in the 90s as well, people were sort of balking at the prospect of the reality of spousal rape, right? And these conversations about what does consent look like in a relationship with someone that you've known over a period of time. And so VAWA, I think this newest reiteration is really looking to hone in on those nuanced areas or those gray areas where there could be an assumption that because you're dating someone that you are safe, or because you're dating someone that they respect you and they have your best interests at heart. And what the statistics show, and really what Lori's story shows, is that that's not always the case.
Well, I want to thank Ryan Lindsay for joining us again, reporter for Connecticut Public Radio and the Guns in America Public Radio Reporting Collaborative, and Julie Goldscheid, professor at CUNY Law School. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. This is Where We Live. Up next, we're going to learn how VAWA could be strengthened to help Native American communities. Dr. Lynn Malerba, who is chief of the Mohegan tribe here in Connecticut, will join us. First, it's Connecticut Public Radio's winter fundraising campaign. If you appreciate these conversations, please support us with a pledge today. This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. Coming up tomorrow, 32 million Latinos will be eligible to vote in November. How should President Trump and the Democratic presidential candidates reach out to them? Now, if you're a member of the Hispanic or Latino communities here in Connecticut, on the next Where We Live, we want to hear from you. In this election year, what issues matter most to you? You can join us tomorrow. Now, violence affects both Native American women and men at alarming rates. A 2016 study found that more than half of Native women experience sexual violence in their lifetime. Now, how does the Federal Violence Against Women Act help them, and what gaps remain? Joining us now by phone is Chief Many Hearts, Dr. Lynn Malherbe of the Mohegan Tribe in Uncasville, Connecticut. She's also Secretary of the United South and Eastern Tribe Sovereignty Protection Fund, which represents 27 federally recognized tribal nations. Chief Malherbe, Dr. Malherbe, welcome to the show.
Quite. Thank you, Lucy. Thank you for inviting me to be on this show. This is a very important issue.
I mentioned this statistic that more than half of Native American women experience sexual violence in their lifetime. I got that stat from testimony you gave before the Senate Committee on Indian Affairs back in 2019. Why are rates of violence so high among Native Americans?
Well, I don't know that we have causation and we don't have good causal effect for that. But what is very disconcerting about this statistic is that 96% of crimes committed regarding violent crime for Native women and Native children are committed by non-Natives. Mm-hmm. And children frequently witness or are abused at the same time. And, so given the lack of good data, we really can't get down to, what the causation of that is so that we could deal with that in a better way. Mm.
We're going to be talking about some of the issues you have raised before the Senate Committee on Indian Affairs about ways the federal government should be helping Native American communities nationwide, but also laws and Supreme Court rulings that have impacted how Native tribes are able to respond to this issue. But I first wanted to play a clip from "Sliver of a Full Moon" by Cherokee playwright Mary Catherine Nagel. For our listeners, this play tells the story of the efforts of Native activists around the 2013 VAWA reauthorization. The script includes interviews with Native survivors of domestic violence, and many of the parts are read by survivors themselves, talking about their own experiences. Here's Lisa Brunner, a member of the White Earth Ojibwe Nation, reading part of her story at a performance back in 2015.
My daughter was raped this past summer. Even though they wore bandanas, my daughter recognized their white skin and their blonde hair. They were doing what I call hunting on our reservation. Non-natives know they can come onto our lands and rape us with impunity. My daughter was just in the wrong place at the wrong time. She didn't come and tell me right away. She washed and she hid it.
Again, that's a clip from the play Sliver of a Full Moon, also performed at Yale Law School in 2015. I understand, Dr. Malherbe, you gave opening remarks at that performance. That clip speaks to what you had said earlier about non-Native offenders often abusing Native American women. Tell us your response to that play and, again, the issues that you have raised.
Well, that play was heartbreaking, but unfortunately it is an accurate depiction of what happens in Native communities. And one of the real issues there are jurisdictional issues. When a crime is committed on a reservation, what happens is there are jurisdictional issues around that, and in fact it's considered a federal crime in most instances. In those instances, only 67% of those crimes are never prosecuted. And so non-Native people do feel as though they can offend with impunity on reservations. And Native women living on reservations face murder rates more than 10 times the national average. And that is just a statistic that is astounding. Mm-hmm. And yet, the Department of Justice does not track that. In 2016, the Urban Health Institute found that 5,712 missing Native women. Of those women, only 116 had been logged into the Department of Justice's database.
Can I go back to that one of the statistics that you just recounted for us? 67% of these cases are not prosecuted. Why is that?
Because it's a very complicated jurisdictional issue. In some cases, tribal officers will be the first people to respond, and they have no protections in the Violence Against Women reauthorization, or there should be more. In some cases, the state responds. In some cases, the Bureau of Indian Affairs responds. In some cases, the federal agents respond. The FBI responds. And so there's a chain of custody issues around that, but there's no clear jurisdictional authority, and that just complicates that issue.
And we know that Native American tribal nations like the Mohegan tribe are sovereign political entities within the United States. If these cases were happening in places in Connecticut that were on non-native lands, you'd see a completely different response from authorities.
Exactly right. So think of it, this is very confounding, but given this simple analogy, if a Connecticut resident perpetrated a violent crime in Rhode Island would prosecute that crime, not Connecticut. And yet, in many instances, tribes are not able to prosecute the crimes in their own courts. And so we are looking to expand the ability to do that prosecution, and there is a special domestic violence criminal jurisdiction piece of the law that is being proposed, but it also is in the Tribal Law and Order Act and the Violence Against Women Act of 2013. But there are states that refuse to allow that to continue, and they believe that the state governments still have jurisdiction over those offenses that are committed in Indian country, which we disagree with.
Again, joining me by phone is Chief Many Hearts Dr. Lynn Malerba of the Mohegan Tribe in Uncasville, Connecticut, as we talk about some of these gaps that still remain in the Federal Violence Against Women Act, and also how the federal government allows Native American communities on how they can have jurisdiction to prosecute, go after these particular offenders on tribal lands. You mentioned the VAWA renewals in 2013. There have been some provisions to help address these jurisdiction issues. Can you talk about some of the other gaps, and what has been the response even from our own Connecticut congressional delegation, Dr. Malerba?
I think usually our Connecticut delegation is very good about responding to issues around social justice, social equity, and public safety. And so I believe that the current reauthorization bill needs to come to a vote. And so we would, of course, ask them to support Senator Feinstein's bill, which includes Title IX, Safety for Indigenous Women. And that's where a lot of those gaps will be closed if we can get that bill passed.
We were talking earlier about how to deal with prosecution of cases, helping domestic violence survivors. But what about children and also assaults on police officers on tribal lands?
Exactly. And so that's what we're looking. We're looking to close those gaps. If you look at the Title IX that I just mentioned, Safety for Indigenous Women, it includes covered crimes and jurisdictions, so it helps with better data sharing, it helps with better data collection, and it closes those loopholes in that assaults of tribal justice personnel would be covered, child violence, dating violence, obstruction of justice, sexual violence, sexual trafficking, children experiencing violence or witnessing violence, stalking, and violations of protective orders. All of those are loopholes and gaps right now that are not covered, and we are looking to make sure that we are creating the safest environment we can for our tribal communities.
Because we are here in Connecticut, I'm wondering if you could talk a little more about some of the experiences that the Mohegan tribe, even the Mashantucket Pequot tribal nation, have experienced in terms of dealing with this issue.
Well, we would obviously deal with this issue within our own tribal communities, particularly when we think about the effects of trauma and how violence affects the next generations, because we do believe that when children experience traumatic events, that it does change your DNA and your epigenetics, and so we need to address that early on, and we need to address it in a very robust way. I think, with both of our tribes, we work very closely with our state, local, and federal jurisdictions, and, so we collaborate and coordinate, I think, pretty well with the local law enforcement here.
I mentioned that you are part of, secretary rather, of this United South and Eastern Tribes Sovereignty Protection Fund. When you're working with these other 27 federally recognized tribal nations to address some of these issues, what are they bringing up that are issues that VAWA, even the jurisdictional problems they face that are impacting their communities?
Well, I think, a lot of what's being affected, and I will say that some of the tribes within our USET family, as we say, are actually exercising the domestic violence special criminal jurisdiction capabilities and authorities under the 2013 VAWA reauthorization. So we're really happy about that because we think that when tribes then do take advantage of those authorities, their court systems are working really well. And if, for instance, there was a study that talked about those tribes that are exercising those authorities, out of the people that they have prosecuted, 85 of the defendants that they have prosecuted had 378 prior contact with tribal police before their tribe implemented these authorities. But 51% of those defendants were sent to batterer intervention or some other rehabilitation program because we know that we need to address why people are in this circumstance as opposed to just putting people in jail because they will just come out and reoffend. So we need to look at what are the causes of reoffending and how can we address those. But in those tribes that actually have taken over those cases, not one case and not one single petition for habeas corpus review has been brought to federal court. So even the people that are going into those tribal courts are suggesting that there is fairness within the courts and they are satisfied with the outcomes.
Well, I want to thank again Chief Many Hearts Dr. Lynn Malerba, again in the Mohegan Tribe in Uncasville, Connecticut. Our time was short, but we do appreciate you giving us some of your time to talk about these issues. Thanks again. This is Where We Live. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. Today's show produced by Carmen Baskoff. Our technical producer is Kat Pastor. It's also our winter fundraising campaign. If you appreciate the wide variety of programs and conversations on WNPR and on Where We Live, please support this program with a pledge.